Adam Johnston, one of the directors of NCD International, and I've been excitedly looking forward to sharing with you about this topic today. I believe it has the potential to completely change our NCD progress and to help us see a much bigger picture of the significance of what we have the privilege of bringing about as NCD coaches. It's just past 3 a.m. here in Brisbane, Australia, so please add about 10% to whatever passion you sense from me today, and hopefully that will be somewhere near my daytime enthusiasm for today's topic. Joining me in speaking with you today is my wife Melinda, who has been one of my closest wrestling companions over the course of my NCD ministry.
Hello.
And my daughter Taylor.
Hello.
Who some of you may have met via the NCD Survey website help desk. Melinda and Taylor will be sharing with you later on a little of how our topic for today is already becoming part of their everyday lives. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please let us know via the chat window, and Bert, our partner support guy at NCD International, will endeavour to assist you. Throughout today's webinar, we'll also be looking for feedback from you at various points using some of the tools available to us through this platform. I'll give you some instructions at the time. We will also have a question and answer time later on. In addition, our webinar today is being recorded, so you'll be able to play it back in part or in whole later on via a link we'll send you afterwards. Before we get underway though, it would be particularly nice to get to know each other just a little bit more. So I invite you to move to the picture that's on your screen. Hopefully you can see that there. You'll see there's hopefully some tools available to you, a little bit of a pencil, and I'd like you to just simply draw on the map where you're joining us from today. If you're not in the US. Great. Wonderful spread there. Arrow into my corner of the world, far away. Lovely. And if you've completed that, perhaps if you could just type into the chat window the denominations or movements that you're most closely associated with, or the denominations and movements that you primarily coach in the context of your NCD ministry. Excellent. Lovely to see a great variety in the picture there. It's certainly one of the most exciting parts I've always found about the NCD ministry is the ability to join with groups of people from a wide variety of parts of the Christian church and to be able to speak together using the common language of NCD. I've always loved that since the very earliest days. All right, excellent. So just a little bit more to get to know you today. I'd like to just invite you to take a short poll, and the question that will come up on your screen is what are the most common 1 or 2 maximum factors you have dealt with in your coaching ministry? So we're looking at maximum factors. So just tick 1 or 2 that you are regularly finding yourself coming across. Okay, I see plenty of responses coming in there. That's excellent. A few moments there. All right, I think just about everyone has voted on that. Let me just present the results to you here. Okay, so it appears that passionate spirituality is one of the most common maximum factors that we're all addressing. Not too often gift-based ministry, not so often effective structures. Yeah, quite a few for holistic small groups. Good to know. I I guess I was pretty keen to ask about the maximum factor area because I like to encourage and remind NCD coaches how valuable it is to spend some time with your local churches or denominations celebrating maximum factors. The challenge we have in NCD ministry is that very often we are bringing about the minimum factor focus, and sometimes it can get people a little bit down, but it's very, very helpful as a starting point for people to be solidified in their maximum factor and to feel confident that God is already working through them in certain ways, and on that basis likely to be willing to address and look into their minimum factor. So I simply encourage you with that along the way, apart from the fact it's wonderful to see some of these areas that are coming on earth as they are in heaven, as I like to put it from the maximum factor perspective. All right, thank you for that. So moving back to our presentation. The question, why are we talking about the three spheres of natural church development? Well, if I come at this for a moment with a question that is sometimes posed to me, and the question is, am I happy with the progress we see through NCD? Now, I actually have two completely opposite but honest responses to this question. The first response that I have is yes, absolutely yes. It's incredibly exciting to be part of a process and a paradigm that to a certain extent is without peers in terms of its capacity to speak across many different denominations, across incredible diversity of cultures, many, many different countries, and in so doing to be able to present objective information about church life and to a little process which see progress in health, but also they can see as a result of that increase in the growth rates within their churches. So one answer I have is yes. And of course the other extremely opposite answer is a very emphatic no. Part of me looks at the progress that we see within churches, and particularly churches I work directly with myself, and I think to myself, well, while it may be encouraging, if we take seriously the universal principles that God has given us, the audacity and the extraordinary nature of the gospel of Jesus Christ that we present, and we consider the gentle but powerful the Holy Spirit of me be progress that which we see. There must be more. If I even brought together the greatest progress of some of the churches that I work with and made that the norm, my concern would be that I still wouldn't necessarily be seeing a revival break out. So part of me is naturally concerned by the idea that we should see even more progress, even though to a great extent it's not really possible to see much better progress by any other means around the planet. But nevertheless, within NCD, we are committed to increasing fruitfulness and being able to take, as NCD coaches, take churches even further and to see even more rapid progress within the health and development of congregations. So against this backdrop, the initial kind of picture to provide you with in terms of the three spheres is that the three spheres are a framework for helping us understand what is involved in seeing greater progress in church health and fruitfulness. Now, if we give some more background to this before we start dealing with the specifics, if we take a look at the average progress between NCD surveys of churches from right around the world, so we can move into our international database and find this kind of information, this is the sort of picture that we see. So between first and second surveys, about 3.5 points progress. Second and third surveys, about 2 points progress. Between third and fourth surveys, a little under 1 point progress. So immediately we see a fairly significant trend here as churches continue to move into the NCD process. And the obvious question is, why does the progress seem to slow down? Because in fact, there are a number of very good reasons that we could reasonably expect the progress would be maintained or even potentially increase the further churches move into the process. And some of these are the following. We have the point that there is a lot further that such churches can go. The average church will begin at about 50 points on average. And of course, having followed on average this level of increase over 3 or 4 surveys, they would only be at about 56 points of average. So many of you may have worked with churches that perhaps have an average in around 60 points, 70 points, even 80 points. So there's an awful lot of headroom still available to make much greater progress. So we don't have the concern that we have a bunch of super athlete churches that simply would find it very difficult to make further progress. There's clearly more headroom for progress within the NCD survey process. So that's one reason to expect for them to move further to a much greater extent. A secondary point, the average church has made progress and has momentum by this point. So they've started the process. So we're only talking about churches that have repeated the survey and on average have seen increases in their results. And that being the case, that progress brings about a certain degree of momentum that they should be able to build upon. So it would seem reasonable they could maintain or even potentially increase their progress over time. A third point we could consider is that they understand the results and process better over time. They know how to read the reports. They know what the process involves. So to some extent, there are certain barriers being removed simply by being familiar with the process. Another point to consider for why we should expect good progress is they have an increasing idea of what works and what doesn't work. They're getting better eyes for what it means to naturally develop a church. So all of these points act in favor of seeing more positive progress. So if we are seeing, as the chart on the left indicates, some level of decline in progress over time, we need to probe that further and consider what might be behind that. So possible reasons for declining progress. We may have things like, okay, you just don't like NCD anymore. Well, that could be a possibility, except one of the challenges there is that if a church doesn't like NCD anymore, usually that will happen at the time of the first survey, as many of you may have experienced, simply because they don't like what the result's saying to them. And so they say NCD must would feel so in this chart anyway, because they wouldn't be repeating the survey. But interestingly enough, we also have some research done by our partner in Canada. I think Bill, you may be with us today, that looked into finding out from churches that had lapsed from using NCD a number of different things. One of the questions asked of churches that hadn't been involved in NCD for a few years was, would you recommend NCD to others? And what was extraordinary and quite challenging to consider is that the overwhelming response was very positive. That is, that even though we're not really using NCD ourselves actively and haven't done so for a few years, we would be very inclined to recommend it to other people. So even the fact that they have discontinued using the process for a period of time, they still very much seem to believe in the principles. So there's a bit of a challenge there. And if we consider another point, the non-use of detailed profiles is certainly an area that we should consider, because there does seem to be some fairly strong evidence that as a church moves deeper into the NCD process and their results even start to flatten out or level out, it becomes a little more difficult to determine exactly what your minimum factor means. So getting some more information around that can be very helpful. And there are some churches that perhaps haven't been able to make use of our profiles, and perhaps so. Considering a bit further, another reason, getting distracted by their maximum factor or the latest thing. Many of us have encountered this, a challenge that the latest program comes into town, or there's some new fad within the church, and there's a certain distractibility that can come into churches, and people can jump onto a different horse, even though they were starting to make progress and they've become distracted, but sometimes even just distracted by their own maximum factor and the enjoyment and preference they have for working towards their strengths. So this could be a factor in the background. Another point is that for some people, progress is just not fast enough. Our decline has not turned to revival yet. Sometimes it's important to try to remind churches that if you're in decline, it may be a little while before it flattens out and then you move towards some level of growth. And of course, we should always encourage churches to consider what's their point of comparison. So if things are not moving as quickly as they want, is there some other means that they could move quicker? If not, well, maybe it was simply going to take a little longer than they expected. Finally, one of the factors to consider is, are the churches simply hitting deeper cultural sticking points after picking some low-hanging fruit? So what I mean by this is that churches can move into the NCD process, and through simply taking care of a few things that they've perhaps known about but haven't really dealt with over a period of time, they can then make some early progress, but then soon after they start to hit deeper cultural sticking points that start to really hold them up. So these are a number of factors that could be considered or as reasons for declining progress. Now, the important thing is we need to be able to get to the bottom of this and work out, are there some clear indicators as to why this might be the case? So as coaches, we can begin to help churches to unblock that and see them make far more consistent progress into the future. So against this backdrop, we can say the question, so what are the three spheres of natural church development? Well, the three spheres of NCD are a way of seeing and helping the health of a local church to develop and radiate outwards to ultimately transform its community. This is a kind of salt and light picture. What we do as coaches is to try to help churches to increase their saltiness and increase the brightness of their light on a hill, if you like. Not just for internal purposes, though it's beneficial to the people in the church. Of course, what we're doing is ultimately for the sake of people who are not yet part of a particular local church. And we're endeavoring, therefore, to have a transformative effect on the community around the church. However, as we've seen, there seems to be some significant barriers that hold a church back from doing so and improving to this sort of level. Even when they've entered the NCD process. So as coaches, we are in the ministry of helping to remove barriers. So the three spheres helps us to understand some barriers that are often unrecognized and therefore will limit the upward progress of a church towards community transformation. When it's important to emphasize about some perspective of developing churches, some new idea to add into the NCD toolbox. Instead, the three spheres are in fact a descriptive picture that highlights how natural, radiating, salt and light church development actually takes place. It is grounded in what we can identify that local church leaders tend to automatically do, and therefore what needs to be adjusted and expanded in their approach for the sake of further and faster progress. Now, before describing each sphere, time for another quick poll. So the question this time around is related to minimum factors. So you will see this little poll come up on the screen. So we're asking the question, what are the most common one or two minimum factors you have dealt with in your coaching ministry? So please just take a moment to click on those. Okay, a couple of moments more. All right, looks like the votes are all cast. Okay, so we have relatively even distribution, but it does appear that holistic small groups is perhaps the most common minimum factor in the picture there. Passionate spirituality, one of the least common minimum factors in the picture. Yes, and yeah, a distribution of different areas. So we've certainly got the whole picture represented here within the group, and reasonable distribution. Now, what I will point out straight away is in relation to our presentation, that anyone who had frequently comes across passionate spirituality or inspiring worship as their most common minimum factor, we must give a little bit of condolence to you, because we have been able to realize that passionate inspiring are the least progress in the early stages of the NCD process. So it's
an area that, of course, we need to look into and is quite pertinent in terms of the topic we're looking at right now. And before anyone asks, just for your interest, the area that makes some of the largest progress in the first couple of rounds of the NCD process is empowering leadership, which is tremendous news. Fantastic to see that leaders are discovering how to be a bit more empowering as they start off on their NCD journey with their church. Okay, so in the context of our framework, our spheres framework, move on again what spheres are about. The leadership sphere is basically the initial realm in which a pastoral leadership team begins to look at and address their NCD survey results. So we think of those minimum factors you were referring to and listed a moment ago. At this point, they're just simply seeing that minimum factor and saying, what do we do about this? How do we make some degree of progress? Now, the important question is, faced with their first NCD results, what do we know about the approach taken by most pastors and leadership teams when trying to make progress? Well, for the first time, what we've done is we've looked at breaking the NCD survey into the items where the responsibility sits primarily with the leadership at a corporate organizational level. So what do I mean by this? These kind of items are consistent with that. Ones like our leaders actively seek to remove barriers that limit our ministry. Evangelistic activities of our family, Jesus Christ. Our leaders regularly raise and acknowledge volunteers. So areas where the responsibility sits a little more so at the corporate kind of organizational leadership level. Now, what we've looked at is to contrast those with items where the responsibility sits closer to a personal level. So items like, I know my gifts, times of prayer, an inspiring experience for me. I prepare myself to participate in the worship service. I try to deepen my relationships with people who do not yet know Jesus Christ. When church does a job, oops, sorry, just seeing some audio difficulties there. Okay, do we still have audio cutting in and out, or? Okay. Okay, I might just, looks to be getting some different experiences from people. All right, I might persevere with that. My apologies if it becomes too difficult to pick up on. As I mentioned, it will certainly be available on YouTube later. We'll be able to send you a link for that. So apologies, unable to necessarily do anything with the connections at the moment. Okay. We'll continue forward. So we've done a comparison then of these different types of items from the survey. Now, one of the hypotheses around this and a possibility in terms of the way this might turn out was that personal change doesn't require a vote or a broad agreement. Whereas organizational level change can be thwarted at many different points and depends on broad agreement. So perhaps we'll see more progress in the personal items as opposed to the corporate items. Okay, so what did we find? Well, here was the verdict. Leadership teams see 85% more progress in the corporate organizational items of the survey than they do in the personal items in the first survey cycle. So this is a considerable difference between the level of progress made in each of these different item sets. Almost double the progress made in corporate items as opposed to personal items. So this is very noteworthy in terms of what leaders automatically do in response to their NCD survey results. Now, this is despite the strong emphasis in NCD writing about the transformation of the heads, hands, and hearts of people. For example, on the cover of one of the main texts, Colour Your World with NCD, this is exactly what's written. about that kind of head, hand, heart transformation that is part of church development. So that's intriguing in itself. Of particular interest in this difference in the progress is that the organisational action tendency tended to be even stronger in the areas I mentioned earlier, passionate spirituality and inspiring worship, the two areas that experience the least progress. So there's something very significant seems to be emerging about this default mode of operation when leaders are confronted with the challenge of making progress on their results. But on reflection, should we be surprised by this very strong bias to an organisational response? Well, if we think about it, in most church life, what do we affirm leaders for? Many times it is putting together a good worship service, making sure the church is running well, making sure that the finances are taken care of. And this relates to the pastor and the elders. There are many organisational dimensions that they will be held accountable for. Sadly, on the other side, the tendency can be that they are perhaps not held as accountable or not affirmed as much for the absolutely central dimension of discipling people in the life of the church. If that goes a week or month or year without taking place to a large extent, many times questions won't necessarily be asked. And if we add on top of that, in this day and age of litigation and challenges, the demands for compliance that sit on the shoulders of pastors and elders to fit in with child safety and legal requirements at all sorts of levels, there is just a wave of administrative organisation things that leaders need to be mindful of that to some extent mean that it's not surprising perhaps that when they approach NCD survey results, even with the encouragement to consider the head, hands, hearts of people, they will still potentially have a much more organisational response. Okay. So what do we do about this strong automatic tendency to see we see from church leaders? Well, okay, first of all, I would simply suggest that we should celebrate it. After all, one of our first goals as NCD coaches should be to see some kind of progress that brings some momentum we can build upon. After all, consider the kinds of things that are making progress within these churches. So here are the three top items from churches all around the world when they move from their first to second survey. Here's the three items that make the largest degree of progress. So the first one, our leaders actively seek to remove barriers that limit my ministry. So it's absolutely fantastic. That's the absolute heart of what NCD is about, removing barriers. And great, the best progress is being made in that area. I know the goals we're working towards as a church. Again, absolutely fantastic. And third, I know what value my work has in the overall work of the church. So leaders are helping people to find their place within the church, perhaps in an organizational way, but nevertheless, they are really doing some incredible work to create an environment which people can grow an environment of this. And we must appreciate that this is a great start. However, we know from general NCD principles that you can't just keep using your strengths, which in this case would be the capacity to bring about organizational change. If we do, we should expect to see the kind of drop-off in progress that we are seeing in this chart. So beyond the leadership sphere, where leadership teams begin the NCD process, we must help leaders to expand their NCD approach so that they don't try to just vote and organize the kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven, but help it to be embodied in the lives of the congregation. Now, speaking of embodying the principles of NCD at a personal level, time for another quick poll. So the question this time relates to engagement in the empowerment test. Invite you on this. Question, have you made use of the NCD empowerment test related to the 3 colours of leadership? Yeah, I see responses coming in there. Give a little bit more time for that. Okay, so here's our result. So a number of people have not experienced the empowerment test to this point. Quite a few have made use of it for themselves, and a number of people have used it for their own leadership development and also with a group of people. Okay, great. That's a good start, and certainly an important dimension of working out what it means to embody and personalize the principles of NCD into our own lives. Okay, so one of the underlying themes of the 3 spheres approach is that of expanding our understanding and application of the principles of NCD beyond just a guide to help sphere. One of those areas for dramatic expansion in the days ahead must be engagement of the youth of the church with the principles of NCD. Against this background, I've invited my daughter Taylor to just share with you for a few moments her personal experiences with the empowerment test.
Hello. I was what you would call a strong-willed child. Some would kindly say a born leader. Others might say a primal force of nature. No matter which way you spin it, there was some power within me that would need some harnessing. When I was 13, I took the empowerment test, and it came up with some interesting results. I was pretty good at learning from mistakes. I just wasn't good at permitting them. If I or anyone else made a mistake, I'd make sure we learnt from them. I just wouldn't let anyone make any in the first place. This test was really instructive for me, and it made me feel like I had this massive head start with exploring my own power and ability. Over time, it got me thinking that right at the point where teenagers are discovering or wrestling with their power, energy, hormones, or whatever else you want to call it, in the church, we often just find them a fun social activity to take part in, or sometimes, if they're lucky, some kind of basic job to do. But many teenagers are just as happy to find those kind of things elsewhere. Teenagers have so much energy and influence and power, and we can't turn it off. So isn't there something unique we should be doing with young people in the kingdom of God? Why not start to harness their power at a much earlier age and teach young people how to empower and lead others? The next generation and the head start can have with exploring things. I'm 17 now, and the leadership lessons I have learnt have been invaluable in my relationships with those around me, in my work as a dance teacher, and in my work for NCD International on Help Desk. Speaking of which, thanks for listening, and perhaps we'll bump into each other via the help desk sometime.
Thank you, Taylor. I personally get very excited by the prospect of looking into the future of NCD ministry and having many, many more young people being able to experience the benefits of the simplification that comes when you can deal with the challenges of life on the basis of the universal principles that NCD presents. It's exciting to watch up close and personal, and I believe it's a huge area of growth and development that we must explore as part of our collective NCD ministry into the future. Okay, so returning to our descriptions. So we've begun looking at the spheres where most churches begin the NCD process, in the leadership sphere. And we've noted the very strong tendency towards an organisational response to NCD survey results. This points us to the clear need to balance this out with a more personal response to the subsequent results. This leads us into the congregation sphere. Now, a series of perhaps familiar questions are helpful in understanding the heart of this sphere. So, what is the church? the church's people. Pardon me. My screen has become unresponsive. No, here we go now. What is the health of the church? It is the health in the heads, hands, hearts of its people. How do we improve the health of the church? We improve the health in the heads, hands, and hearts of its people. So some progress can clearly be made through an organisational response to the NCD survey results, as we observe in the initial leadership sphere. It creates a healthy environment in which the healthy growth of disciples is more likely. But unless NCD implementation at a given point begins to aim more directly at the people who are the church, we should expect to see limited progress. Now, moving into this level, this sphere of the NCD process, requires us to increasingly approach the church's minimum factor as a discipleship minimum factor. There is much said in church circles about discipleship. Discipleship is part of the Great Commission. It's very important. Yes, we must do more of it. But in many cases, many leaders speak of their insecurity about how to do it, the sense of whether there's enough time to be able to do it, and many pressures surrounding this. But generally speaking, no one would disagree that discipleship is an absolutely core and central part of the mission of the church. However, as we know, there are often many barriers to it taking place. And so in the context of the NCD process, this shift to viewing your minimum factor as a discipleship minimum factor is a significant and vital one. Now, what we can do is we can look at dimensions of discipleship down the left of the screen here. Now, you'll note, of course, that these directly relate to the quality characteristics of NCD, and they are in that way 8 markers of a fully developed disciple. Such a person must be empowering, their gifts must be activated, they must activate the gifts of others, they must be passionate, must be effective and fruitful in what they do, and so on. And so these are key indicators about a person's own discipleship journey. And the beauty of understanding the quality characteristics as dimensions of discipleship is because when a church comes up with a particular minimum factor, rather than trying to deal with the entire realm of what discipleship involves, there is a quite clear shortcut to some extent to say at the moment our congregation collectively needs to be better discipled in this area because it relates to our minimum factor. And so rather than a huge task of trying to address the topic of discipleship, it can be narrowed down on the basis of the NCD survey results as a means of transforming the heads, hands, hearts of the people in the church towards greater health and growth of the whole congregation. Let me give a couple of examples of what this really looks like. So imagine a church has come up with, say, passionate spirituality in their first survey results. So in the leadership sphere, again, this is not what we prescribe, but what just tends to be done by leaders. They will mostly lean a little bit towards organizational responses. So they might organize some prayer chains, distribute some Bible reading guides, may do a sermon series on spiritual passion, various responses to passionate spirituality to try to create a better environment to see some progress. Now, once they move forward, on average, they will see some progress. However, they haven't necessarily moved into this congregation, heads, hands, hearts sphere of the church with that area. So if it happened to be the case that they're still wrestling with passionate spirituality by the second survey, well, that's a point where they need to say, what does this mean in the lives of the people of our congregation? Are we helping our people to deal with whether prayer is an inspiring experience by helping them to understand their own unique spiritual styles, the ways in which they most directly connect with God? And so that's an example of going deeper with the process in order to make sure it's not just organizational, but also has this personal dimension that goes much deeper and helps the church make much more progress. Another example quickly would be that inspiring worship might be the initial minimum factor of a church. So the leadership puts a lot of time into trying to improve the quality of the service, fine-tuning the run sheet, addressing the musicians, improving their quality, perhaps trying to polish up the sermons a little bit more, various things that sit more at the leadership sphere realm. But then once they move forward in the process, they may start to hit other barriers in that congregation, asking the question, are people really bringing something of worth to worship? Are our people bringing a blessing that is to bless God and to bless the rest of the congregation? Well, this question often never really comes up, and the people in the congregation are often treated as kind of passive onlookers or participants within worship, instead of helping them personally to grow as worshippers, which of course dramatically increases the energy and vitality and raw materials available in the service in order to see something really inspiring happen. So moving into that next sphere is a critical part, and it applies in all areas of NCD survey results. Now, what we have, just as a little bit of a help around this, some of you may be familiar with Christian Schwartz's, one of his recent little booklets, The All By Itself Pathway, and in that book, he has ventured a little bit more into the referred quality characteristics in accordance with their personal dimensions, these dimensions of discipleship we've talked about on the side here. So you might like to have a little bit of read there sometime, just to help us to move more into this kind of language and help people to understand results at that personal level. So in many ways, the congregation sphere is where we try to balance the responsibility for the health of the church between the leadership and the church members. So we make sure we are not developing customers, but instead disciples. Now, sadly, churches with a bent for excessive professionalism and entertaining their people, and sadly there are some growing trends around that in some parts of the church. Now, if they do that, even if they don't realize it, they will generally have extra difficulty making this transition into the congregation sphere, because they are working so hard to try to polish the organizational side of the church without necessarily seeing their people change. And at the end of the day, you can't grow your church without growing your people. You are going to hit significant limits. So moving into this sphere is essential. So if you are working with a church that has started the NCD process with a fairly strong organizational approach, like most tend to, then probably need to lean to in and risk survey. Evaluation and wisdom in these things is essential. But as a rule of thumb, they should probably be at least starting to look at that congregational dimension by the time of the second survey. All right, time for another quick poll. It has an affinity with the topic we've just been exploring, the congregation sphere. This time round, the question for you is, screen for you. Okay, oops, here we go. Which of the color tools have you used with a group? So please just mark your responses there. Okay, another couple of seconds. Oops, sorry, I just being informed that I haven't got multiple options there. Okay, that's not going to be the ideal poll. My apologies for that. Okay, so anyway, the results where people, I guess, were only able to select one. Clearly, the three colours of ministry has been very heavily used, and three colours of love also used to quite an extent. That's excellent. That's great, and it'd be great as we develop more experiences around those tools as we try to explore this congregational sphere. Okay, so if a church has expanded its NCD process into the congregation sphere, the principles are taking root at quite a deep level in the life of the church. But there is further we can and must go. So this takes us then into the community sphere. Now, the best way to begin exploring what this sphere is about is to ask a question. So the question being, how much time does the average church member spend in church organized activities? Now, if we consider that in general, let's put it in very round terms, the average fortunate person would be awake for about 100 hours each week. So in those waking hours, what percentage of that would they be in church organized activities? Well, let's take a number, something in the order of about 10%. This would mean approximately 10 hours were perhaps spent in those kind of activities. Now, what do we mean by that? It could be worship service, it could be small groups, social gatherings, ministry teams, team meetings of various different kinds. But in all likelihood, even 10% would be a fairly active church member in all likelihood. Now, what do I mean by church organized activities? What's the importance of looking at this? Well, if we think about the place where leaders and influencers in the church can be salt and light to the other members of the church, where they have proximity to the other people in church life, well, it's mostly going to be in church organized activities. That's where most of the rubbing off onto other people is going to take place. And so in the context of NCD, we're trying to improve the culture of the church. We're trying to improve the habits and change the way that people live out their Christian lives. And so this proximity of leaders and people of influence is an incredibly important part of seeing that happen in the life of the church. However, of course, if 10% of time approximately is being spent in church organized activities, this naturally means that about 90% of the waking hours, the vast majority of people's time, is then being spent outside of that direct sphere of influence. So that's a lot of time. Now, how do these realms interact? Well, of course, what we're hoping for and the intention of what we're doing in most of those church organized activities, apart from celebrating and enjoying each other's company, is that there's a wave of sorts that builds up in those activities that's able to wash over and flow out into the other parts of life and have a positive influence. And certainly that's exactly what happens. However, we might say the good health of a local church out in all those activities and everything that happens washes out and has some degree of effect in the workplace of people, in the homes, in the other gatherings that people are a part of through the course of the week. However, we must also recognize on the other perspective that the good and the bad of the rest of life also flows in and influences local church life. So if people have a reason to celebrate, someone has a baby, someone gets engaged, someone graduates from school, there is some breakthrough that happens out in the rest of life, ideally the reasons for that celebration and that joy flow back into the life of the church and have a very positive influence. But of course, as we know, the dark things that happen out in the rest of life also then have a significant effect in local church life. Now, you step back into the realm of being an NCD coach or a pastor or leadership team dealing with their NCD survey results. That's a potential for an awful lot of cross current and challenge that you need to deal with. And you've really got to be hoping that things are going pretty well in the rest of life in order to not end up diluting all the hard work you're putting in to try to improve, let alone maintain the health of your local church. So these dynamics we need to see very clearly. And it's important to note that historically it may have been somewhat different. Many years ago, people perhaps tended to live together a little more. Those they went to church with, they many times perhaps worked with as well. They were with each other in the marketplace. And so there was a lot more proximity of leaders and people of influence with the people of the church. And so that then becomes a challenge in our modern environment where there is so much more mobility, and the mobility of society is clearly a large factor in all of this, because people are able to travel so much more to be part of their local church, and anytime spending a lot more of their time separated from each other. And so challenge, but it's need for clever and wise ways of dealing with these dynamics, so that we don't see our efforts at church development thwarted along the way. Now, at this point, it's useful to take a little bit of a side turn in this context, because as we talk about the community sphere and moving into that space and having the principles of NCD permeate this large space, this 90% of time where people spend most of their Christian life, it begins to cross over a little bit with topics perhaps expressed in terms of what it is to be a missional church. Now, there is a lot of discussion around these sorts of topics, and unfortunately it's not particularly well defined, and yet many churches that we work with are perhaps involved in discussions these days about the form and new expressions of church life and ways of doing church. My deep concern is that there's also a lot of confusion and anxiety that comes out of a lot of that, in part because a lot of the terminology and things spoken about are not very well defined. And I believe as NCD coaches, we have a significant opportunity and responsibility to try to bring some clarity into some of this anxiety that's experienced within the church today. So just a few points on this. Spheres concept is to have a great speaking clarity and unify church tasks from the form and structure of church life. So some of the concerns that I have relate to some of the concepts often expressed. So we hear in some contexts that churches must become more outward focused. Now, the major challenge with this for an NCD coach or anyone involved in NCD is that it's not actually true. Objectively speaking, maybe about half the churches we work with need to become more outward focused, but fully half of the other churches, in many cases for a season of time, need to become more inward focused. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that if you have a church that is very strong in need-oriented evangelism, very strong on loving people outside in the community in this other part of life, precisely the problem they have is that as soon as those people move towards the local church or want to become part of it, they step inside the fellowship and they immediately start moving towards the back door of the church, precisely because the relationships, the intimacy, the degree of empowerment is not developed within the church. The kind of internal parts are not there. And so that outward focus that they already have is being wasted to some extent because they haven't developed the health of the fellowship itself. So again, this is a thing that causes distraction in many cases, where churches who are already strong on the outward focus feel they need to become even stronger on it, so they just improve their maximum factor even further, and sadly don't see any progress because the issues are internal. If we take another phrase that goes around in the church in this sort of community sphere realm, we must move away from an attractional approach to church. Now, this one, from an NCD coach perspective, we must look at and say this is very, very unfortunate choice of wording. If attractional is a problem, then we can only assume that to develop churches that are unattractive or maybe even repulsive is somehow the goal. It just simply doesn't make any sense. If the gospel message is present and seen clearly, if the universal principles of God are being lived out in a particular context, and the power of the Spirit is working in a place, that's going to be really, really attractive. And it doesn't matter what kind of form of church you're putting in place. If it is healthy in that kind of way, it's going to be attractive. And so, again, we must be willing as coaches to speak into this space, because it's not a dynamic that we want to shy away from. We must define the discussion in much clearer terms so that we can help pastors and leaders feel more secure in what they are putting their energies into, ideally the health of their church. Now, a third one that comes up is we must take an incarnational approach to ministry. Again, this has become very a popular kind of notion in recent times, and who could disagree with it? Of course, it's to follow Christ in a sense, in the way that we live out the Christian life. But as we can see by our wave diagram, the idea of being incarnate, living out, taking the Spirit of Christ into the world where you go, well, it's not a quantitative issue, because the vast majority of people in the life of the church already live the vast amount of their time outside of church organized activity. So proximity for most people to others who don't know Christ is not really a problem. There's plenty of connection and opportunity to connect there. So really, at the end of the day, the primary issue is simply whether the saltiness and the brightness of light, that is the health in the heads, hands, hearts of those people, is at a high level. Because if it is, it will automatically have an incredible missional effect, if you like. There will be much fruit borne by that. So again, there is a lot of confusion, unfortunately, and insecurity that comes from some of these discussions. And I believe, and I must say, it has been remiss of us at NCD to not speak a little more directly into these discussions until this time. But certainly over the next period of time, we'll be speaking much more into it in order to try to bring the clarity that NCD is able to bring. So in summary around these points, we can say whatever form of church you pursue will be missional to the extent that the people live out the principles of NCD. There is no exclusion from that, no matter what form of church you may be, whatever form you might be pursuing at the time. And so I believe the spheres concept is a way of understanding the radiating natural development of a church from the leadership sphere to the congregation sphere out into the community sphere is going to provide us with a way to strongly and clearly speak into this discussion on the basis of universal principles, and ideally bring much more unity and fruitfulness to all of those working to see the kingdom come. So in summary, the community sphere is about empowering church members and people in the local community to understand and live out the principles of NCD everywhere they go in daily life, so that new life flows into the world and into the church. If we have people engaging with the principles in all those hours that are outside of organized church activities, then the inflow and the benefit for church development is going to be enormous. We are simply making use of much more of the time available, and this in turn will mean progressively a shift in focus for church leaders to say, how do we equip our people to a much greater extent where they live most of their lives, and not just in the context of the church organized activities, but all again completely consistent with the principles we know from natural church development. In a moment, I'll share about an exciting new tool soon to be launched that is designed specifically to bring the principles of NCD directly into the community sphere for Christians and non-Christians alike. Very excited about that. Okay, so we move to the all-important practical question, again, just purely in this introductory kind of session around the spheres idea. But how can we help churches expand into the three spheres? Very important question. All right, so if we move into the first level, then we sphere, not unnecessary. Say the NCD Church Survey is the starting point, and that is our main tool of use as NCD coaches. Now, I just want to highlight that we have put together a page for coaches as a source of tools and tips for helping churches engage, to make progress, and to remain consistent in the NCD process. So if you are a registered coach, you will have access to this page. If not already, you'll certainly have that within the next day or so. So that can be found at the address on the screen there, or simply when you're logged into the NCD Church Survey website, under your customers section, you'll see a coaching tab there. Over time, we'll be adding lots of extra tools and downloads and various tips around that. But to the largest extent, you will find many different things that can help you to start a church off in the process, make some early progress, and then also see them increase their progress over time as they potentially and ideally move through the spheres. Okay, now I should mention that shortly we'll also be adding a video of the spheres concept that you will be able to make use of to introduce that to churches, to provide them with a big picture glimpse and preview of what the process, NCD process, will involve in order to ultimately see the goal of community transformation. But if we move to the second sphere and talk from a tools perspective, some of you may have already come across cycle starters on the NCD Church Survey website. These are just single page, free downloadable PDFs that can be used with the leadership team to prompt them on some simple ideas to begin making progress with their results. They've been quite popular and seem to be appreciated for people who are not quite sure or a little insecure about the first steps to take. Now, the cycle starters are also very useful to extend then and use in the congregation sphere, simply by speaking with small groups or any gatherings of congregational members, presenting them with the results of the church, and then inviting them to take one of these cycle starter sheets, to look at it, to pick something out of the list of suggestions that they might personally engage in order to do their part of transforming the life of the church. So really something that will change their own heads, hands and hearts. So this is something already available and an excellent way to expand into that congregation sphere as part of the NCD process. But of course, in addition to this, in the congregation sphere, we have the three-color discipleship tools. Now, tools are always optional in the NCD world. Principles you can't get away from. Tools are always optional. However, it's significant that these particular tools have been designed to directly align with the head, hand, heart's needs related to each of the quality characteristics. So they are purpose-built really to deal with the challenges that come with this second congregational sphere. So many of you are familiar with them to some extent, but I just highlight here that on the e-tests page on the Three Color World website, we now have some additional that go to use in a larger group, and so the step-by-step instructions are there. So that can be very helpful along the way. Now, an important little aside around this is, for many people, they become a bit overwhelmed by the number of tools and principles and various things associated with NCD. Now, if you took them away and took the options away from them, they would be equally distressed because they would want more options. And this is a challenge we constantly face, that there's too much or there's too little, etc., etc. But another great benefit of the spheres approach is that we can take some of the pressure off churches along the way and help them to be able to just simply focus on the need this. So in short, take a look at your minimum factor, make some progress on your church survey results, take some simple action steps, and off you go. Get some momentum, make some progress. And we can look at the other parts of the NCD system later on. And so we can give them a preview and say, at a given point, you will need to address the congregation sphere, but for the moment, you can just settle into the basic and minimum factor approach and some simple action steps. And so it allows us to spread out the intellectual load, if you like, of what's involved in developing a healthy church right out to the community sphere, and really resource people in a just-in-time approach to lessen some of that load. Right, now moving on to the congregation sphere. So I'm very excited that very shortly, in the coming weeks, we will be launching the My Oikos survey. So what is the My Oikos survey? Well, for those of you who know your Greek reasonably well, then oikos is, of course, the Greek word for household, used many times in its various forms throughout the New Testament. And oikos was, to the largest extent, the form that the church took in the first few hundred years, where there was quite extraordinary growth experience of the kingdom of God. So the My Oikos survey takes a look at a person's extended household, their sphere of influence in life. Now, your oikos is the one social unit you can never actually leave. You can't join it, you can't leave it. It's always a part of you. It's an extension of your own life. So since it is the most basic social unit of the whole of society, it's a fantastic place for us to explore with the principles of NCD and help people to engage with those principles right where they are. And so it means that in that 90% of time where people are spending most of their life, we can begin to apply NCD principles in a very concrete, direct way. So this person in the picture here, the guy in the middle, he's within his own oikos, but he's also a part of a local church. He's part of a tennis team. He's also in a work team where he gets to drive in the back of the truck. And he's in these different spheres of life, but his oikos is very much central to his social experience, and therefore will become a critical central point within the Christian life. Now, much more to be said on this, of course, and I invite you sometime after the webinar to take a look at myoikos.life, where we have a little video there you might like to look at, and we will most certainly let you know the moment that that is ready. You're very much coming in at the ground floor on this with us, which is great, and we'll let you know when that's ready to go in a few weeks' time, and we'd love to see you as part of that, an extension of your NCD ministry. Now, given the possibilities of taking NCD principles all the way out into the community sphere and seeing a whole new level of community transformation take place, I'd now like to ask my wife, Melinda, to share a little about her experiences of NCD principles in all of life. Thank you, Melinda.
Hi there. Our journey of discovering NCD principles began in the late 90s when Adam brought home the original NCD White Book from work. His boss at the time required him to read it and to get to know the material. For a couple of nights, it was Adam's and my bedtime reading. Only after reading it, we couldn't sleep. It created a torrent of discussion and dreaming. To think, all the complexities of church life could be broken down to 8 key areas, and then to focus on just one area, the minimum factor, would help the church to grow all by itself. This was breathtaking. But hang on, we just recently planted a church. Darn! What if we had have known about these principles earlier? And what about many of our friends and family who are full-time pastors burning themselves out? What if it's because they're pouring energy into things that aren't actually going to help? How many of our pastor friends consider themselves failures for not producing results? Just how many people would be freed from the needless burden if they knew and aligned themselves with these principles? These principles could be life-changing. The wonder of that early discovery didn't just stop there. It morphed and it grew into what is now an 18-year journey of wondering and experimenting with how these principles should and could apply to every part of life. How the principles apply to our marriage, how we can apply them to kids ministry in Sunday schools and kids clubs, youth groups we've been involved in, how they apply to our kids and their everyday world, to the issues we have with each other as a family, how the principles apply to our kids' dance school. The principal of our children's dance school, although not a churchgoer, did the empowerment test. How cool is that? And we've started to find out just what wonders the principles can bring in applying them to boys that come courting our 3 daughters. It's been a running joke in our family for years that Adam wouldn't come to the front door with a shotgun when boys came calling, but with a handful of 3-color surveys. And because our daughters knew this, they issued the survey order to the boys themselves. Adam didn't have to fire a shot. You want my dad to say yes to you dating me? Here, you better fill in this love survey and be able to tell him where you're at with the fruit of the Spirit. Oh, and here's the gift test, the community test, and the empowerment test. And there'll be more to come, don't you worry. Amazingly, the boys actually take part. Whether or not it's just for the father's approval, they willingly take these surveys and pepper us, as the parents of the girls they're interested in, with questions over meals. One of the boys interested in our daughter, Melinda, what do you do when your principles laid out on a platter with the 3 colours of love book? This is actually an enjoyable and clear conversation to have. Talk about simplification and clarity of issues in relationships. So our kids are growing up knowing not to blame silly teenage hormones or to label bad character as a phase of life or spats with one another as normal family life, but to call it for what it is, underdeveloped fruit of the Spirit. It's actually been very exciting of late as a mother of 4 to see these principles at work in our children. So much joy has been injected into our lives from discovering these principles, but as Mrs. NCD Australia, so to speak, and hearing glimpses of the international picture through Adam, I have often been distressed that there hasn't been the tsunami of transformation we should fully expect as a result of these unchanging, unshakable principles being so widely known through the worldwide church. Why is this so? Adam and I have been deeply searching, and out of this searching was born the Oikos Project. Soon people all over the world will be able to measure how the principles of God are being lived out in their households. So not only will I be able to teach my children the principles and apply the principles to my everyday, I'll be able to measure the actual effect in my oikos. I'm looking forward to the tsunami of transformation the principles of God applied in every aspect of people's lives will have. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Melinda. As you can tell, she's a little bit passionate about the topic, as am I, because it is truly exciting to see what happens when the principles are moved more deeply communities. Right, for now, and so what we'd like to do is over the next number of minutes just to take any questions from you. Please just write them into the chat window. We perhaps won't be able to provide answers immediately, but we will, however, certainly provide them on the webinar page that we'll send a link to later on. So if any of your questions aren't answered, we'll definitely supply an answer there. So please just write any questions you have into the chat window, and we'll gradually try to work through some as we head towards wrapping up this webinar. Our pleasure, Peter. Some of you can perhaps hear the birds waking up just before the sun comes up here. Okay, so hopefully some of you might have some questions we can respond to that you can write into the chat window. Glad to see you having Vegemite for breakfast, Vince. Very Australian of you, thank you. Okay, Carl, excellent question. Creek, intriguingly, it's a little bit of history around that with the survey. There was actually some quite in-depth discussions with the Willow people and NCD in the early stages, with the prospect of some degree of partnership in research. And to be honest, there was quite a degree of interest from the Willow people, the lady in charge in particular, having only just discovered that NCD existed. Unfortunately, from the Willow side, there was a significant reticence to connect with us and work more on that basis. In terms of the organisational versus spiritual health tool, perspective NCD, again, NCD research is fairly comprehensive in terms of what are the essential elements collectively necessary to see churches become healthy, and we've not had any strong arguments against that, and so we just maintain the position that we have. But it would have been nice to have had more partnership happening there, but unfortunately from their side they weren't quite so keen in the end, in part to do with their own branding issues, etc. But always very keen to do that sort of partnership. Okay, Randy, is there a way we can get a copy of your PowerPoint from this webinar? Certainly, yeah, we'll have the video of the presentation, and as I say, the short video of the concepts we'll make available very soon. And also as part of that, we're going to produce a generic kind of PowerPoint. So if you prefer not to just play a video to people, but would like to present the concept yourself and customize your own presentation, then we're keen to provide that as part as well. Okay, looking through the questions. Yeah, okay, Skip, you mentioned Dave, perhaps Dave Wetzler told you Willow Creek wanted their own product. Yeah, that was part of the background. Dave was previously part of and advanced discussions in different ways, and found it great, a lot of difficulty in doing that. Okay, Antonio, the 8 quality characteristics, other principles, the 6 growth forces. Yes, these are certainly very significant in the overall package of NCD. They really are the organic principles in the background of the quality characteristics. And Christoph Scholk, who is in our meeting today, will be presenting a webinar later this year that will be specifically focusing on those growth forces. So be sure to tune into that. Yes. Yes, Susan, yes, the Oikos survey addresses everyday social networks. Yes, certainly. It's going to be very, very exciting space. Yeah, we're looking forward to it. It's been a number of years under development, and yeah, certainly very excited to see what that does, both in those communities themselves, but also what it does for the sake of local churches in helping them, giving them a huge leg up in their efforts to improve the health of their local congregation. Okay, Joseph, can I elaborate on the benefits available to new and existing coaches? I may leave that to Peter Chinkala, the NCD partner, to respond to you with on that topic. You're certainly receiving more information in the coming days, a whole sort of package of what that includes for a coach. So please look out for that, and that will do. Know what's involved there. Yep, Skip. So we'll make those available from the presentation. Okay, Peter. Yes. So in terms of what will be available from this presentation, the video, of the presentation itself, the links are referred to on the church survey website for the partner support, the coach support page, where you can find lots of helps and suggestions about helping churches to improve their health generally, and also moving deeper into these spheres that we've been referring to. Leroy, is the Fruit of the Spirit test available online? Not just yet. We are working very hard that the next test that will be coming online will be the spiritual style test associated with passionate spirituality. So the book is already available, but the capacity to use these tests online has become very, very popular because it's a very easy way for leaders to deploy the tests, very convenient way that allows the results to automatically be shared back to the leaders, and all sorts of benefits like that. And it's a nice lightweight approach. So the spirituality test will be the next one, following that will then be the Fruit of the Spirit test. We'll be moving that online as well. Yes, and the Fruit of the Spirit test is available in the book, The Three Colours of Love. So it's available in paper form at this time and can certainly be used in that way. Okay, any other questions at the moment? All right. We certainly won't be closing the door to discussion. We're obviously very keen to continue the dialogue on these topics into the days ahead. It's a very exciting phase we're moving into with the spheres concepts, with things like myokos, and then all of the flow back into what this means for the church survey process as well, and our ability to help churches to make much more progress there. Okay, Joseph, are there examples of churches that did not experience diminishing returns? Again, I think one of the best sources to explore that, I know that Peter, the NCD America partner, is doing quite a bit of work going around gathering a lot of stories and experiences from churches that have made excellent progress, and he's compiling that. That will form a significant part of his upcoming webinar, and also I believe some of that information will be made available over time for more direct access. I must say, we haven't done the greatest job over time of collecting the stories of NCD. We've focused so much on the principles, we've tended to neglect the stories a little bit, which is very unfortunate. But given there are so many stories around the globe of many different experiences, and certainly many stories through the US, Peter has rightly identified the need to collect many of those stories just for the encouragement and also opportunity to network with those people and learn from them and discover, okay, well, what did they do? What does it look like in really practical terms to move more deeply into the process and see more consistent progress? I can certainly refer to an example. Peter's just mentioning there in the chat, if any of the participants in this webinar have stories, please contact Peter at NCD America. He'd be very keen to collect those sort of stories. I can give one quick anecdote on this. A close colleague of mine that engaged in the city process, almost a book version of what we now are referring to as Spheres approach, with gift-based ministry as a challenge in the beginning of the process. Over the course of their NCD survey, over just 3 or 4 surveys, they improved their minimum factor to become their maximum factor. In fact, their minimum factor improved by over 45 points. And clearly a significant part of that was that they did begin, as many do, with some organisational adjustments about their approach to gift-based ministry. But then they appointed a person whose responsibility was absolutely to focus on that personal dimension, embracing and addressing their gifts at that level and allowing the church to be shaped far more by the gifts of the people as opposed to just the overall picture of how the leaders want a church to be. So it's just one little example that doesn't necessarily prove anything, but there certainly are the pictures of what happens when people move in at that deep level. Okay, well, it's coming time for us to wrap up this webinar and to say farewell for now. So let me just close by saying there are very good reasons to expect that what we now perceive as good NCD progress will in future be seen as really quite slow. With a clearer understanding of the spheres that need to be transformed and embraced as part of the NCD process, we as coaches can help churches establish a much more robust and consistent plan for moving ahead. The basic principles of NCD remain exactly the same. However, how broadly we apply them and how far into the congregation and community spheres we carry those principles is the new frontier that we must explore. Even after more than 2 decades of NCD implementation, to be honest, we're really just scratching the surface of what is possible when God's universal principles, the scandalous gospel message that we carry, and the power of the Holy Spirit are fully released. This has only really been an introduction to this concept, so much more to think about and to discuss, and certainly much more support around it to be provided. But glad that you could be part of this. As I mentioned, you'll be receiving some additional support from NCD America soon, and some additional details. We'll make sure we get all these links and things out to you in the next few days. However, if you have any further thoughts or questions around anything presented today, please don't hesitate to drop me a note at adam@threecolourworld.org, and I'd love to continue the discussion there. So in broad terms, we've been talking today about expanding our view of empowerment. That's another way of looking at it, to say that what does it mean for us to help leaders to not just empower people in the local church context, but to go even more broadly than that, and to take the principles of density deep into the community. And so on this basis of empowerment, I just like the Word of God to be the final voice in what we speak about today. And so, very familiar passage. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Lord Jesus, we thank you so much for your grace and the incredible privilege we have to partner with you in this ministry. It's a profoundly empowering thing that you have done for us, both on the cross and in enabling us to partner with you. It's an awesome privilege, and we thank you for that, and we pray for courage and the focus and wisdom necessary to take these new insights that we discover about how your church grows, and to deliver those and present those to churches, and really see your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And love you, Jesus. And we pray all this in your powerful name and for your sake. Amen. Thank you all for coming along, and we look forward to connecting with you more into the future. God bless.